What's up everybody, welcome back to Middle Earth. My name is Bludborn, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the Harrowing of Morgul on tier 3. But before we get started, if you haven't done so already, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you get more content like this later on. Alright, let's go ahead and dive on into this. I'm going to make a couple assumptions here. If you're doing this on tier 3, I'm going to assume that you've done the questing and that you've at least done it on solo tier 1, so you're kind of familiar with the layout and some of the other things. The intent of this video is that we're going to break down some of the individual things that enemies have and some of the things that you can do to counter that, and some of the best practices to beat this dungeon quickly and efficiently. It should also be noted that not everything I cover in this video is going to need to be done for every group. This is more just covering every detail of all the effects that are cast and all the skills and things that can be interrupted and cured. One of the first things that you're going to notice about this, seeing as this is on difficulty tier 3, all of the mobs and the bosses are going to have plus 200% morale, 150% more damage being dealt. They're also going to have plus 35% armor, plus 35% ratings to their avoidance, resistance, and armor penetration. Now this dungeon does have several different types of enemies in it, so we do need to talk about a target priority. In this case, we have Goblin Scouts, Archers, Defilers, Warriors, and Sergeants, in that order. And the reason that we want to take out the Goblin Scouts first is because they have the ability to inflict a debuff on you called Serious Wound. Serious Wound can be put on by all of the Goblin Scouts, and it is going to do 28,504 common damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. Now this is largely going to be mitigated, but these can stack with some of the other effects in here, and this is why it's important to cure these as often as you can. Next up, we want to deal with the Archers. The reason the Archers are important to deal with is because they will actually inflict a poison arrow on you that is going to do an additional 24,721 common damage every 3 seconds for 36 seconds. Again, this is going to stack with some of those other wounds and other effects that get cast. And it is usually recommended, if you have a bunch of melee targets that are also in the mix with ranged, is to have your tank take those melee targets and pull them back to the ranged, because then the ranged effects don't take effect anymore and that ranged target becomes a melee target. And it's a lot easier for your melee classes to AoE and hit all of them. Next up, we're going to deal with the Defilers. The Defilers actually have several abilities, some of them that you can actually interrupt, and some of them are debuffs that are going to get put on you that can be cured. So we're going to look at Corrupt Renewal, which is a heal over time that is put on some of the surrounding enemies. That can be interrupted. And then also Pungent Salve, which is a direct heal that is put on enemies around the Defiler, can also be interrupted. Now some of the things that get put on you would be Poison Lethargy, which can be cured. This one's kind of a big deal because it is going to add 20% to your attack duration for a minute and 20 seconds. So you definitely want to cure that so that you can do as much damage as possible. They will also put a random poison debuff, just a generic poison debuff on you. It is also going to do about 30,000 common damage every 3 seconds for 21 seconds. So you can see how all these effects just keep stacking and stacking, and so if you don't cure them, even though they sometimes sound insignificant, they can stack and start causing a lot of damage very, very quickly. There's also a debuff that is going to mainly get put on the tank, which is Weakened Armor. This is going to remove 35,342 armor value. The reason why this is important is armor value becomes a lot of your common mitigation. So any of those effects that we were talking about earlier that do common damage, if you have weakened armor on you, it is going to do a lot more damage to you. So it's a good one to remove as well. And the last one of the effects that the Defilers can cast isn't really a huge deal, but I do want to make note of it, which is Minor Diseased Frailty. This is a disease that can be removed. It decreases your vitality by 506. So again, not a huge deal in the number of stats and everything, but if you have the ability to remove it, best thing to do is go ahead and remove it. So next up we have the warriors. Now the warriors don't really do anything special. They do have a non-removable rage buff, which is going to give them plus 10% melee damage, but it's also going to make them take an additional 10% incoming damage. That's all there really is to note about that. They do have a 180-degree frontal attack, so make sure you are standing behind the target. You should be kind of making that a best practice anyway, of standing behind targets, but just as a reminder, stand behind them so you don't take the frontal attacks. And lastly, we do have the sergeants. The sergeants have a lot more health, and they do a war cry heal, which will heal any of the targets that are around them. And same thing is that they do also have 180-degree frontal attacks, so make sure you're behind them as well. Alright, so let's get on to boss 1, Shaktur. This is actually a pretty straightforward fight. There's only really a couple of mechanics that you need to worry about, and most of the mechanics really only fall onto the tank. So during the fight, the boss is actually going to put a debuff on the tank that is called Volley. You basically get a 5-second warning from Volley before the Roaring Inferno gets placed on the ground, and that's just going to leave a flaming puddle on the ground for about 5 minutes. You don't take damage if you run through the fire, so if you're one of the non-tanks in the group, you can run through the fire just fine. You won't take any additional damage, only if you stand in the fire. You know, kind of raid 101, don't stand on the fire. Yeah, don't stand on the fire. He does also fire arrows at random party members, inflicting the slowed debuff. This is a poison that can be removed. It does reduce your movement speed by 25% for 15 seconds. So again, if you're a melee class, this is kind of important because you're going to be moving around so you're not standing in fire. Get that off of yourself as quickly as you can. Now, Shaktur has 2 audio cues that you want to listen for or watch for in chat. The first one is don't run. This will actually be when he's casting Arcing Strike. This is a distributed frontal AoE cone damage. This is actually easily avoidable by the tank, so all they have to do is run directly through the target and they will not take the damage, which also means it will not get distributed to everybody else as well. The second one is when he says, gather around you maggots. This is also a frontal AoE cone damage. It can be avoided by running through the boss. This one does happen a lot more quickly, so as soon as you hear that audio cue, run through them and you won't take that damage. So really when it comes down to it, you want to have your tank face the boss away from the group and move away from the fire puddles, and that's really all there is to it. There will be some additional Goblin Scouts that will spawn when the boss's health hits 75% and 50% health. Now these Goblin Scouts are the same ones that you've encountered earlier in the dungeon, so make sure you're watching out for the serious wound debuff and clearing that as quickly as possible. You can go ahead and kill the Goblin Scouts and then get back on the boss. Once this boss is defeated, you're really going to be just in kind of a rinse and repeat through some of the same mobs that we've seen earlier in the dungeon. So I'm going to skip through a little bit of this and head into the second boss. Alright, so this brings us to the final boss, which is Dargosh. Dargosh also has 2 additional wargs that will spawn with him, and then wargs will spawn periodically through the rest of the fight. Now, the best thing to do with this is to target the boss and AoE the wargs if you have a class that can AoE, but you do want to take care of the wargs as well, because what they can do is they can also put on the serious wound debuff that we saw earlier from the Goblin Scouts, but they can also do a crippled debuff, which is another wound, It's going to reduce the run speed by 25% and also take off 5,000 might. Now, Dargosh also has 4 audio cues. One of them actually doesn't do anything, which is a pox upon you all. If you see that, don't worry about it. Nothing's actually happening. The ones that we actually want to worry about, the first one is going to be minions to me. This can be interrupted. This is him attempting to spawn additional wards. The next audio cue that we want to look for is when Dargosh says, "Come closer." This is when he is casting Shadow Cloud, which is a big 360-degree spike damage. Now you just need to get out of range of it, and from the looks of it, it's about 13 to 15 meters on the range to being safe and not taking any damage. This skill can also not be interrupted, so you just need to get out of range. He does get stationary when he casts this, so it is possible even for a tank to get out of the way of this, but definitely your other 2 players should be out of the way for this hit. Lastly, this is the one that happens and really kind of can make this fight a little bit more challenging if you don't maneuver the boss in a way to give yourself room. The last audio cue you want to listen for is "Contagion shall devour you." What will happen in this case is he's going to place a poison cloud on the tank, and the tank is going to drop 1 major poison air every 3 seconds for 9 seconds. Now what you want to do with this is you actually want to wait until all 3 of those clouds drop and then move, because if you move between each one of those, you're going to be placing more puddles, and a decent tank should be able to go ahead and stand in all 3 of them and then move, so you can give yourself more room. All right, so that should be the Harrowing of Morgul on tier 3. I hope you had a lot of luck with your loot and got something that was a little bit of an upgrade out of it. So thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, make sure to like it and also subscribe, and I hope to see you guys on the live streams.